Hi there, welcome to this session. I'm Dr. James Wakefield. I'm the Director Asia Pacific for Delphic HSE. We are a safety and regulatory consultancy specialising in cosmetic safety and regulatory compliance in a lot of different markets around the world. I'm speaking to you today from Hong Kong, so I hope that you are well wherever you are in the world. Today we're going to talk about the regulatory shifts in China. So in particular, there are some big changes which have just taken place with the cosmetic regulations in China, and just understanding what are some of the difficulties, the opportunities and the challenges in taking advantage of some of those changes. So just a quick overview. The title is about dealing with the red tape. Some of that red tape is being removed. Some of it is still remaining and presenting some challenges, but I'll just talk through about how those can be addressed. Some of the new categories that are coming in for general and special use cosmetics, how those have been changed and realigned. The quality control and safety assessment, the documentation and requirements for import notification and the things that the changes that are happening there. Touching on the regulations around advertising and labeling, the enforcement and penalties for not complying with those regulations, and how what can be done next. So to start off with, the Cosmetic Supervision and Administration Regulation is the new regulation which came into force. It was published in June last year and came into force officially on the 1st of January this year. But in China, there is one overarching regulation, which is this regulation, the CSAR. But then there are a number of subsidiary regulations which come into force at different times, which can then lead to those implementations. The CSAR regulation is the overarching regulation, and it introduces some of the key new concepts, particularly for imported non-special use or what is now general cosmetics in China. Introducing a product notification system instead of a pre-market authorization, introducing a domestic responsible person, adding in requirements for a product safety risk assessment. And one of the key features of that is it means that animal testing can be exempted, and that comes under one of the subsidiary regulations. It doesn't come under the CSAR on its own. But I will talk a bit more about that a bit later. And then post-market supervision and inspection. And those of you who are familiar with the EU cosmetic regulation will see that there's some key concepts there that carry on. And it's a very similar model that is being followed going forward. There are, as I said, some subsidiary regulations. So the Safety and Technical Standards for Cosmetics 2015 is still in force. And that divides into essentially similar to the annexes in the EU cosmetic regulation, where there are banned ingredients, restricted ingredients, some positive lists for things like preservatives, sunscreen agents, colorants and hair dyes, and sets out some test methods for the requirements about what need to be followed in order to market these products in China. There is also some additional prohibited cosmetic ingredients which were recently published as a draft for cosmetic ingredients and some plant or animal cosmetic ingredients. And they're published in order to meet the requirements of the overall CSAR and not specifically as an update to the safety and technical standards. So they will be incorporated at some point, but at the moment they stand separate to that. There is also the inventory of existing cosmetic ingredients in China, and there's a new version just been published. It came into force on the 1st of May 2021. And that is a list which basically indicates whether ingredients have been used in cosmetics in China before. And that helps the NMPA to determine whether an ingredient is new or not. As I said, that was in force from the 1st of May. There were some changes to the previous version, which was the 2015 version. It amended the Chinese INCI names for some ingredients and indicates previous maximum usage levels. So if you're using those ingredients, they're listed on the IECIC and they're below those maximum usage levels, then it means there's a high chance that there won't be any issues with moving forward. If you have ingredients that aren't listed on the IECIC, then they're considered as new ingredients and they need to be registered. And you can apply for a trial use period of 3 years, after which it can be added to the IECIC inventory. But during that time, any animal testing exemption is not allowed. So you would still need to do animal testing for new ingredients. The CSAR has updated slightly the definition of cosmetics, and just to run through what that definition is, it's for products applied to skin, hair, nails, lips, and other human surfaces by scrubbing, spraying, or other similar methods for the purpose of cleaning, protecting, beautifying, and modifying. It's worth pointing out that oral products like toothpaste and mouthwash don't come within the definition of cosmetics under CSAR. There is a separate filing specification for toothpaste, but it is very similar to the cosmetic filing and notification, but there are some different standards with respect to ingredients. So the categories have been slightly changed as well. Under the old hygiene supervision of cosmetics regulation, the special use cosmetics, there were 9 categories of special use cosmetics, as you can see listed there. And non-special use cosmetics were things like skin care, hair care, nail care, perfumes, and makeup. Under the CSAR, special use cosmetics have now been simplified essentially into 5 different categories. So hair dyes, hair perm, skin whitening, sun protection, and cosmetics with new functions. Most other things move to either general cosmetics, or some of them move to medicinal products or therapeutic products. So some of those are moved to general cosmetics, some are moved to medicines. The cosmetics classification rules and catalogue I've now seen has just been finalised on that. So that outlines how cosmetics can be classified based on efficacy claims, application and target sites, target user groups, and formulation types. So that guides whether a product falls within the general cosmetics or whether it falls within medicines. The previous regulatory system required pre-market authorizations. So in particular for imported non-special use cosmetics, or as they are now, general cosmetics. So any cosmetic that was imported into China needed to go through a pre-market authorization, and domestic and imported special use cosmetics also need to go through a pre-market authorization. And mandatory animal testing was required for both of those cases. It could only be waived for domestically made non-special cosmetics. So products made in China or packed or filled in China could be exempt from the animal testing requirements. But one of the big changes is to that requirement in particular. So one of the new requirements is for a product safety risk assessment, and if you can substantiate the safety of the product with using a product safety assessment, then the animal toxicology testing can be exempted. And that was set out in the provisions on the management of cosmetic registration and notification dossiers, and that came into force on the 1st of May this year. So just a few days ago. It is now in force, so it means that imported general cosmetics can, for the first time, be placed on the open market in China without needing to undergo animal testing, which is obviously a very big step. There's a lot of people who've been staying away from China because of the requirements on animal testing. So it paves the way for the first time to actually have legally compliant products on sale on the open market in China as imported cosmetics without needing to go through animal testing. It's worth pointing out, though, that special use cosmetics, whether they're domestically made in China or whether they're imported, do still require laboratory animal tests. So this is in particular for general cosmetics. But it is a big step. Alongside that, in order to substantiate the safety of the product, the NMPA have issued a technical guidance on the cosmetic safety assessment, which again came into force on the 1st of May. And it sets out the requirements for following the substance risk evaluation guidance and the product safety assessment guidance. The safety assessment must be in Chinese, obviously simplified Chinese for mainland China. And it sets out that the safety assessor must have experience in cosmetic safety and at least 5 years of professional experience. So setting out some requirements about who can actually do the safety assessment. There is also a current ranking approach for ingredients. So instead of requiring a full toxicological profile for every ingredient, it does make reference to existing safety and technical standards. So as long as ingredients are listed on the IECIC and they are permitted in the safety and technical standards, then you don't need to do anything else from a safety assessment point of view at this time. You can then also use supporting information from some of the trusted international bodies like the FCCS in the EU, the CIR, the Cosmetic Ingredient Review in the US, and the World Health Organization in particular for acceptable daily intakes. And if you don't have any of that information, then you need to conduct a traditional safety assessment by identifying points of departure and calculating margins of safety. That ranking approach is acceptable during the transition period, which we expect to be around 2 to 3 years. And after that, all ingredients would need to have a full toxicological risk assessment. There are, though, some conditions. You can't just use a safety assessment to exempt animal testing for all general cosmetics. So there are some conditions. In particular, if the product is intended and claimed for use by children or infants, then you can't make use of the animal testing exemption. If the product uses new ingredients, which even if they've been approved or notified but are not yet listed on the IECIC, then again, you can't make use of the animal testing exemption. And if your notifier or your domestic responsible person or manufacturer is classified as a priority entity to be inspected, or they've received an official investigation related to safety quality in the past 3 years, then again, you're not allowed to use the animal testing exemption. But if your products don't meet any of those criteria, and then you are able to use the animal testing exemption and for the first time be able to place imported products onto the market in China without needing to do the animal testing. There is, though, a condition to the safety, the acceptance of safety assessment as well, and that's set out again in the management of cosmetic registration and notification dossiers, which is that as well as having a safety risk assessment, you also need to have a qualification certification of the production quality management system issued by the cosmetics regulatory authority of the country or region that the product is made in. So that means that in order to be eligible for the safety assessment and waiving of the animal testing, a national GMP certification needs to be issued or approved by the local cosmetics regulatory authority within the country of manufacture. It is an issue for a lot of countries. There are some countries around Asia Pacific that do provide GMP certification at a national level. So China itself, Korea, Japan do provide GMP certification. But it can be an issue, particularly for manufacturers in Europe, the US, because there is no national GMP certification. And it's typically provided instead by third-party certification bodies. So it's been suggested, and there have been actually some breakthroughs here, that countries which don't issue national GMP certification can look to recognise an equivalent to national GMP to remove that reliance on animal testing. So although you could have a third-party GMP or an ISO 22716 certificate to notify the product, unless it's been issued or recognised by a competent government department, then it doesn't permit the waiving of the animal testing. But there have been some steps through this part of the red tape, essentially. So the ANSM in France have liaised with the NMPA, and they have set up a way to provide a recognition of GMP certification at a national level. And the NMPA have said that this is acceptable for waiving of the animal testing. There are discussions ongoing in many countries, and I've also just identified that the UK have managed to find a solution to the problem as well. So UK manufacturers now, through the Department of International Trade in the UK, can apply for recognition certificate of the GMP, which should be acceptable for notification and waiving of the animal testing for products for China. We're also aware of discussions going on in other countries, including the US and Australia, about possible solutions about how to solve this problem. But it is something that most governments are taking seriously and are putting steps in place to get around this issue, because having a regulation that allows the waiving of animal testing, but then putting something in place that then prevents that becomes a bit of an issue. So it's putting the responsibility on the governments of the manufacturing countries to put something in place to provide that reassurance at a national government level. There is also some other requirements, particularly around some testing. So there is some additional testing requirements that need to be done at labs in China. So the NMPA approves laboratories which need to do some additional testing in order to be able to fulfill the requirements and put the products on the market in China. So the approved testing lab should have a CMA, which is a certification of the Inspection and Testing Agency. And at minimum, according to fulfill the animal test exemptions, you need to do microbial quality, heavy metal testing, and possible risk substances testing at an approved lab in China. So it is something that does need to be done at a lab in China. The possible risk substances is about identifying common impurities that are likely to be in products. So things like dioxanes, benzene, things like that. There are well-known impurities, and it's a case of identifying the risks that those impurities might pose and being able to prove that they're at acceptable levels. It is worth reiterating, though, that special use cosmetics will still require the animal toxicology tests as well. So particularly these tests for general cosmetics, they don't involve animal testing, but if it's a special use cosmetic, then it still would. So one of the next steps is to identify if your product falls within the category of general cosmetics or special use cosmetics. And you can identify that from the formulation, the function of the product, the market presentation and the claims that are made about the product. If the products are intended for use by children or infants, and the definition here is under 12 years. So if they're intended or claimed for that group, then it means that they are not eligible for the animal testing, the waiving of the animal testing. Again, are any of your ingredients new to China? And who will be your domestic responsible person? They're important questions that you need to ask to see if that is actually available to you. Can the safety of the ingredients in the product be supported by a risk assessment, whether that's through international bodies, through the safety and technical standards, or the safety assessment for the ingredients based on the existing data? And then what standards have been used for that product testing? Because China has individual standards for many of the common tests, and they quite often differ from the ISO standards and need to be performed at labs in China. And also, where is your product manufactured? Is there a system of nationally recognized certification of that GMP status in order to be able to waive the animal testing? For notification, it is moving towards the EU model. So products should be notified through a responsible person. So if it's a domestic product, it should be to a provincial medical products administration. If it's an imported general cosmetic, then it should be notified to the national medical products administration by a domestic responsible person. And that domestic responsible person must be a legal entity based in China. And the obligations are very similar to those of an EU RP, which would be around the notification of the product in the first case, and then adverse event monitoring, implementing product recalls, all of that post-market surveillance and due diligence that would normally go on, because the products obviously evolve over time. There is a regulation that sets out what the requirements are for the roles for the registrant, the filer, the domestic responsible person, or the manufacturing enterprise. And the notification is performed through an online cosmetics registration system, which was actually live from April, so people could pre-apply to set up their accounts in that system. And if a general cosmetic product is imported, that domestic responsible person needs to initiate that process for the filing. It is worth pointing out, though, that there's a lot of information that's required in order to notify a product. It's not just a case of notifying a formulation and asking a few questions about the product. You essentially need to have your whole product dossier available and uploaded in order to be able to notify a product, including the registration application form, the classification code for the product name, the ingredients information, including the manufacturer information and quality specifications, the product dossier, including all of the product technical and test data, manufacturing information, and the quality and safety control requirements that we've just talked about, the product label to make sure that it's compliant with the labeling management measures and the guidelines for the efficacy claims, the product inspection reports, if they need to be tested, and the product safety assessment. So there's a lot of information that needs to be provided. It's not something that can be done particularly quickly. And you need to update your notification if there are changes that don't relate to the safety or efficacy of the product. You change your registrant, the responsible person, the name of the production company or something like that. You only need to file those changes. If there is a change that could affect the safety and the efficacy, so you're changing the manufacturing site or some of the implementation standards changed, then you need to actually apply to change that registration. But if you want to change the name of the product, anything about the formula, the form of the product, they can't be changed. So once it's been notified, you have that product listed in the system. If you want to change any of those, then you have to file a new application. There are a few changes coming up around labeling as well. The labeling guidance is a draft at the moment, but essentially the labeling information, mandatory labeling information is there. The information needs to be in simplified Chinese, and it should follow, the ingredient listing should follow the official Chinese INCI naming that's as set out in the new version of the IECIC. And one of the interesting things about the ingredient listing is that any ingredients which are below 0.1% in a formula can be indicated as other trace materials. So you don't need to indicate everything that's in a product. If you've got low levels of ingredients, then you don't have to actually declare them. And if you've got small products that are less than 15 grams, then you can have some of that label information on a QR code, which is quite interesting, because obviously there can be some challenges with trying to fit a lot of labeling information onto small products. So the application of being able to use a QR code, now that most people have phones that are able to scan them, shows, I think, the way that some of these cosmetic labeling is actually going. There are also guidelines on the efficacy claims that can be made. So this again came into force on the 1st of May, and it sets out the different categories for substantiating different test claims. So whether that is human or clinical tests, consumer tests or laboratory tests, it indicates what tests are required in order to substantiate those certain claims. And you can also use literature, but the NMPA will keep updated a list that includes prohibited claims and the principles of those prohibited claims that you can't make. Then, obviously, post-market supervision, the NMPA will conduct sampling checks regarding the authenticity of the notified materials. So, obviously, if you've uploaded your whole product dossier, then that is available for the authorities to go and audit at any time. And they can inspect to make sure that everything complies. And if they find an incompliance, then they will inform you of a specified period to make corrections. So it won't be a case that if they find an incompliance, then everything needs to be immediately recalled. You do get a time window to be able to address those changes. Obviously, things like if they find incomplete or missing test items, the specifications aren't as required, they think that the safety assessment is not sufficient. They find a non-compliance with the safety standards or any circumstances which they deem insufficient to determine the safety of the product, they could notify you that there is a deficiency and you need to provide more information. There are obviously as well measures for adverse reaction monitoring, and it just sets out the responsibilities for post-market surveillance, identifying who is responsible for each role, the workflow for the adverse event reporting, the risk control, and the adverse effect analysis. The NMPA can apply appropriate enforcement action as necessary, whether that's recall of products, stopping the production or import, cancelling notifications, or restricting a domestic responsible person. And restricting a domestic responsible person could apply to all of the products that responsible person has taken the responsibility for. So not just the products which the action is being taken for. So it's not something to be taken lightly. So it's very much worth thinking about who is your responsible person, and are they doing everything correctly in line with the regulation. So just in summary, imported general cosmetics will be subject to simplified requirements, or they are now subject to simplified requirements. The product notification is replacing the costly and lengthy authorization process. It introduces the domestic responsible person system and the product safety risk assessment to ensure cosmetic safety, so more in line with international standards. And importantly, exemption of animal testing in most cases, apart from products for children and infants, products with new ingredients, or products in which there is no national GMP certification. And then obviously the post-market supervision by the Medical Products Authority. So I hope you've found that useful, that run through about the changes. It's obviously very current, very new. It's only come in within the last 12 days. There's been a lot of talk about things that were going to change, and a lot of, I think, excitement about finally being able to put products into China without going through animal testing. So thank you very much. I am happy to take any questions if there are any questions now.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. I'll reiterate that. Do send in your questions for James to field back to you. I mean, it's all changed in China, and very recently as
Yes.
well. Wow. So I was wondering, have you seen many companies kind of coming to you looking to enter China on the basis of this relaxation of the testing rules on the imported general cosmetics?
Yes, yeah, definitely. There's a lot of buzz around it. There's a lot of interest in the services and being able to enter finally into China without doing the animal testing. I think it's something that was holding a lot of people back from exploring the China market. So finally, it's putting a system in place that actually allows those products to enter China without the animal testing, because ethical brands, everything like that, if people find out that their products have been tested on animals when they're not allowed to be tested on animals anywhere else, it just doesn't look very good for a brand. So because there is finally a route to be able to do that legally, then yes, there is a lot of buzz around that, and a lot of excitement. There's still some question marks because it's a very new process, and I think even the regulators are still trying to learn what is acceptable or not. So I think there will be some teething periods. There will be some periods of training the regulators and the authorities who are actually responsible for implementing the regulation, because obviously there are a lot of people involved in the process in China, that they would need to actually understand all of the different things, and so many of them have only been finalized quite recently. So it is a case of waiting to see how that actually goes, but very much the change has now been made, and it's kind of exciting to be able to take those steps now.
Excellent. And for any brands that might be listening who are considering finally now approaching China because of this, what would you recommend maybe as the first step in that process?
So I think the first step really is making sure, does your product qualify for being able to make use of those animal testing exemptions? Because there are those criteria, as I mentioned, and one of them in particular is around the GMP certification. So it's about thinking, where is your product manufactured, and what is the government in the country that it's manufactured doing to allow this to be accepted? And as I said, in France, in the UK, there are now systems in place in order to enable that, and that will spread. There are more countries that are aware of this situation. So I think as time goes on, that will become less of an issue.
That's good because my next question was going to be about the GMP certification, and whether you thought there was maybe any ad hoc time frame about kind of governments and then, as you say, third party organisations, kind of being able to offer this to people who are interested.
Yeah, so it's quite surprisingly, actually, some of the governments have taken action quite quickly on it and put things in place that they expect to be accepted. So it's quite encouraging, actually, that the governments are taking it seriously, and there are industry bodies that are putting pressure on governments if they haven't made any headway at the moment, in order to actually put something in place, because that obviously then limits the manufacturing base of that country to then be able to launch products into the country. So it does seem to be something that at least some governments are taking seriously, and I think once there becomes a certain capacity of people who've done that, then the other governments, I think, won't have much choice but to also be able to put something in place.
Brilliant. And will the revamped IECIC maybe make the process of passing new ingredients easier than in the past, or is this still going to be something of a difficulty for companies?
Yes, yes. So in the past, the new ingredients went through a very slow process, and there was a lot of new ingredients which weren't approved. So the number of new ingredients which actually got approved was very, very low. So the whole streamlining of the process, it is changing. So it does allow pre-market authorizations and for a trial use period of those ingredients. But it does mean that there are still some limitations on not being able to make use of those animal testing exemptions until things are listed on the IECIC. But it's something that we expect to see more of as we go forward, that IECIC being updated with more and more approved ingredients, which then allow people to innovate a bit more instead of only being fixed with things that are already listed on the IECIC.
Excellent. Well, I'm afraid that might be all we have time for, James, but thank you so much for joining us and for
Okay.
those fantastic answers there as well. Thank you.